It didn't begin with a war. It began with a handshake. In the early 2000s, Apple was still recovering. The company had narrowly avoided collapse just a few years prior. It was the return of Steve Jobs and a single device, the iPod, that brought Apple back from the brink. But even then, no one could have predicted what was coming. A revolution in the way we live, work, and connect. That revolution had a name, the iPhone. Launched in 2007, the iPhone was more than a phone. It was a platform, a lifestyle, a symbol. But for all its sleek design, intuitive interface, and marketing genius, the iPhone was also a logistical miracle. And that miracle depended on one country, China. While Silicon Valley dreamed China built, Shenzhen, a fishing village turned megacity, had already become the beating heart of global electronics. And Foxconn, Apple's now infamous manufacturing partner, had assembled an empire of workers' factories and supply lines capable of producing millions of devices with ruthless efficiency. In Apple's vision, design happened in California, but everything else happened in China. At first, it was a perfect fit. China offered low labor costs, flexible regulations, and a government eager to attract foreign investment. Apple brought prestige jobs and billions in revenue. The partnership boomed. By 2010, Apple was manufacturing most of its products in China. By 2015, China had become Apple's second-largest market. And by 2020, it was more than a partner, it was the lifeblood of the business. But this marriage of convenience came with compromises. To operate in China, Apple had to play by Beijing's rules, and the rules weren't always clear. Apple removed apps from the App Store at the Chinese government's request. VPNs, news apps, books. Even the Quartz app, after it reported on the Hong Kong protests, was pulled. iCloud data from Chinese users was moved to servers run by a state-affiliated company. Encryption keys normally held only by Apple were handed over. The company insisted it was protecting users. Critics said it was enabling surveillance. In the West, Apple stood for privacy. In China, it stood for silence. Steve Jobs once said that Apple existed at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. But in China, that intersection was policed. And Apple, for all its ideals, complied. Why? Because the numbers were staggering. In 2019 alone, Apple generated over $44 billion in revenue from China. That same year, Tim Cook was praised in state-run media as a friend of China. He met with officials, toured factories, and according to the New York Times, signed a secret $275 billion deal in 2016 to help China's economy, promising training, investment, and more. This wasn't just business, it was diplomacy. Apple had become a kind of shadow ambassador between East and West. But while the company maintained a carefully crafted neutrality, tensions were rising elsewhere. The US government grew increasingly alarmed by China's tech ambitions. Huawei was blacklisted, tariffs were imposed, trade wars began. And in the middle stood Apple, deeply entrenched in both camps, trying to serve two masters. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could Apple champion freedom of expression in the West while complying with censorship in China? How could it protect user privacy in Europe while turning over data in the East? The answer, as always, was complex and increasingly uncomfortable. Because Apple didn't just depend on China for production, it depended on it for growth. China's growing middle class, its obsession with status, its hunger for Western brands, all of it made the iPhone more than a gadget. It was a status symbol, a statement, and Apple knew it. Stores opened in Shanghai, Beijing, Chengdu, temples of glass and steel, worshipping innovation. Lines wrapped around the block on launch days. Apple was aspirational and the party approved. But even the most lucrative partnerships come with limits. Behind the scenes, Beijing was tightening control. Internet restrictions deepened. Nationalistic messaging increased. US tech companies were slowly being pushed out or pulled in. Apple, though, remained, and that made it vulnerable. When protesters in Hong Kong used an app to track police movements, China demanded its removal. Apple complied. The backlash was swift. Human rights groups accused the company of enabling repression. Lawmakers in the US called out the hypocrisy. But Apple didn't budge. It said it followed the law of the land. The question was whose law and at what cost. The marriage that once looked like globalization's greatest success story was showing cracks. But divorce wasn't simple, because while Apple tried to keep its image clean, it had built its empire on a foundation it no longer fully controlled. At first, Apple believed it had control. After all, it was the most valuable company in the world. It had reshaped entire industries, redefined retail, and created an ecosystem so powerful it pulled in 1 billion users worldwide. But what Apple failed to fully grasp, at least publicly, was that China didn't play by Silicon Valley's rules, and it never intended to. Beijing never forgot that information was power, and control of that information was non-negotiable. In China, every piece of digital infrastructure, servers, apps, data had to operate under strict government oversight. The so-called Great Firewall wasn't just about blocking Western media or censoring keywords. It was a blueprint for digital sovereignty. And as Apple expanded its footprint, it had to bend slowly, then completely. When Apple launched iCloud in China, it knew storing user data locally would be mandatory. But rather than merely renting server space, Apple agreed to transfer control of the encryption keys to a company run by the Chinese government. This wasn't a technical detail. It was a historic shift. In the US, Apple had once refused to help the FBI unlock a terrorist's iPhone, citing privacy and user trust. In China, it handed over the keys without resistance. The logic was simple: comply or leave. But Apple wasn't prepared to leave. The stakes were too high. China had become the centerpiece of Apple's supply chain strategy. More than 95% of iPhones were assembled there in mega factories with hundreds of thousands of workers. The entire infrastructure, logistics, labor, suppliers was built over a decade to optimize for China's scale and speed. No other country could replicate it, at least not quickly. And Apple knew it, so it made more compromises. Apps that discussed Tiananmen Square disappeared from the App Store. Podcasts that touched on human rights were quietly removed. Developers were warned not to use politically sensitive keywords. Even emoji, the innocuous symbols of global digital speech, were censored. Users in China saw different icons, a different world. Then came the Xinjiang question. Reports emerged in 2020 that Chinese suppliers in Apple's chain were using forced labor from Uyghur Muslims detained in so-called re-education camps. Investigations linked several suppliers, including Lens Technology and O-Film, to these labor transfers. Apple said it found no evidence. Human rights groups disagreed. The US Congress proposed legislation requiring companies to cut ties with any entity connected to forced labor in Xinjiang. Apple lobbied to weaken the bill. In public, Apple claimed to uphold the highest standards. In private, it fought regulations that might disrupt its relationship with Beijing. But the deeper risk wasn't reputational, it was operational. As US-China tensions escalated, Apple found itself increasingly at the mercy of Chinese political winds. Rumors swirled of officials pressuring state-owned firms to boycott iPhones. Nationalist influencers on Weibo called for consumers to buy Chinese. State media began celebrating local tech brands like Huawei and Xiaomi as symbols of independence, and Apple's position grew precarious. In 2022, a single factory protest sent shockwaves through global markets. At Foxconn's largest iPhone assembly plant in Zhengzhou, known as iPhone City, thousands of workers revolted over harsh COVID lockdowns, unpaid bonuses, and unsafe conditions. The scenes were unprecedented: workers clashing with hazmat-clad police, escaping through fences, live-streaming their dissent. The chaos caused production delays for Apple's flagship product right before the holiday season. Apple had always prided itself on operational precision, but this time the chaos was outside its control. It wasn't just about supply chains anymore. It was about sovereignty. For years, Apple had kept its China strategy quiet, surgical. It avoided political commentary, maintained cordial relationships, and played the long game. But that strategy began to collapse under the weight of geopolitical reality. The Chinese Communist Party wasn't content with passive compliance, it demanded alignment. And Apple, once the disruptor, had become the hostage. Even Tim Cook's legacy became entangled. Hailed as the architect of Apple's supply chain miracle, he was now criticized for building the company's fortunes on a geopolitical fault line. Every product announcement, every new Apple store in China, was now scrutinized for signs of submission or defiance. Behind closed doors, Apple began diversifying its assembly lines, investing in India, Vietnam, and Indonesia. But these were not replacements, they were contingency plans. Decoupling from China was not just expensive, it was existential. Because unlike other American companies, Apple had built itself into a Chinese success story, and Beijing wasn't going to let that go easily. No bombs fell, no armies marched. But make no mistake, a war had begun. It was a war not of land or ideology, but of semiconductors, data flows, and digital control. A war in which every line of code, every supply chain node, and every product launch had become part of a larger strategic battle between two superpowers. And Apple, arguably the most iconic symbol of American innovation, had become a primary front in that war. The spark came in 2018, when the US government began targeting Chinese telecom giant Huawei, citing national security concerns. The allegations were serious espionage backdoors, surveillance cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party. Whether entirely provable or not, the US launched a scorched earth campaign blocking Huawei from using US-made chips, cutting off Android access, and pressuring allies to do the same. China responded with fury and resolve. In Beijing's eyes, this wasn't about Huawei. It was about China's future. The US wasn't just punishing a company, it was trying to strangle a country's tech ambitions. So China accelerated plans for technological self-reliance, investing billions in domestic chip-making, AI, quantum computing, and 5G. The slogan was clear: no more dependence. Caught in the middle was Apple. On one hand, it relied on Chinese factories for manufacturing, Chinese consumers for revenue, and the Chinese government for access. On the other, it was an American company deeply entangled with Washington's priorities, its infrastructure built atop US software tools and chips. Every geopolitical flare-up became a direct threat to Apple's core. Tariffs imposed by the Trump administration in 2019 shook markets. If fully enforced, they would have added billions in costs to Apple's Chinese-made products. Tim Cook personally lobbied the White House, arguing that punishing Apple would give unfair advantage to its Korean rival Samsung. Some tariffs were delayed, others waived. But the message was clear. Apple was no longer just a business, it was leverage. The US began scrutinizing supply chains, pressuring companies to reshore production. China, in turn, began tightening control of its rare earth exports, critical materials for electronics manufacturing. In the shadows, cybersecurity experts warned of backdoors, hacks, and state-sponsored attacks. Every device became a potential spy. Every app, a vulnerability. And then came Taiwan, the nerve center of global chip-making. The vast majority of Apple's high-performance chips were fabricated by TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. But Taiwan's ambiguous political status and China's claims over it made this supply chain incredibly fragile. Any military conflict or even a blockade could bring Apple's production to a grinding halt. The Pentagon knew this, Beijing knew this, and so did Apple. To mitigate risk, Apple began investing in chip production elsewhere. It announced plans to source some chips from Arizona. It diversified suppliers. It increased automation. But none of these moves could replace China. The scale, the infrastructure, the human capital, it was irreplaceable, at least in the near term. Meanwhile, in China, Apple's leverage was slipping. Homegrown phone makers like Huawei, Xiaomi, and Oppo had grown in sophistication, producing devices that rivaled the iPhone at lower prices. Chinese nationalists increasingly framed the iPhone as a symbol of Western arrogance, and Beijing, once content to allow Apple's success, now viewed it with suspicion. State-backed media accused Apple of aiding American surveillance. Officials suggested switching to domestic phones in government offices. Reports emerged of regional bans on iPhones in sensitive departments. And every time a new iPhone launched, there were rumors of retaliation, boycotts, or supply chain interference. To stay alive in this environment, Apple doubled down on diplomacy. Tim Cook traveled to China, repeatedly meeting with provincial leaders, visiting stores, speaking at government-sponsored events. He praised China's innovation, its workforce, its partnership. He avoided political topics. Apple increased local investment, emphasized job creation, opened research centers. The goal was clear: survival through soft power. But soft power has limits. Apple's attempts to remain apolitical increasingly rang hollow. its silence during Hong Kong protests, its compliance with censorship, its lobbying against US human rights laws. To critics, Apple was no longer just neutral, it was complicit. And yet the company faced a deeper dilemma. Even if Apple wanted to leave China, it couldn't. The costs of departure were staggering, not just in dollars, but in logistics, relationships, and reputation. Apple's products weren't just assembled in China, they were born there. The suppliers, the engineers, the precision tooling, it was all deeply embedded in the Chinese industrial ecosystem. Decoupling was not a switch, it was a surgery, one that risked bleeding the patient. So Apple played both sides. It obeyed Washington's laws but complied with Beijing's requests. It preached privacy but handed over keys. It marketed freedom but embraced censorship. It was at once the victim, the beneficiary, and the enabler of a broken system. And as the US and China drifted further apart politically, economically, ideologically, Apple's position became increasingly untenable. Apple has always been a master of illusion. It sold minimalism but was built on complex supply chains. It promised simplicity while orchestrating the most intricate logistics in the world. It marketed values, privacy, freedom, creativity, but behind the scenes, it made decisions not for ideals, but for survival. Now the illusion was breaking. The 2020s had revealed the core contradiction of Apple's empire, that it depended on the very regime that threatened the principles it claimed to uphold. And as the US and China moved from competition to confrontation, Apple's balancing act was becoming impossible. In Washington, bipartisan consensus was forming. China was no longer just a rival, it was a threat. Politicians from both parties began demanding answers from US companies, especially Apple. Why were Chinese censorship laws being obeyed? Why were American user rights compromised? Why was a flagship US corporation lobbying against human rights legislation? In 2023, a congressional hearing summoned Apple executives to testify on supply chain ethics, data security, and ties to Beijing. Under oath, they claimed compliance with all laws, denial of wrongdoing, and commitment to ethical sourcing. But lawmakers weren't satisfied. The narrative had shifted. Apple was no longer the pride of American innovation. It was evidence in a larger case against globalization itself. At the same time, pressure mounted in Beijing. China had grown more emboldened. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the country sought to eliminate foreign dependencies, especially in core technologies. iPhones were still popular, but the government no longer saw Apple as an asset. It saw it as a liability, a potential tool of Western influence, a company too big, too foreign, and too hard to control. Rumors began to swirl that Apple would be restricted in schools, in state agencies, in military zones, that domestic brands would receive preferential treatment, that future software updates would be subject to review, even that a backdoor could be required for national security. And Apple had few cards left to play, because despite its size, despite its influence, Apple had never built true independence. Its entire production machine still leaned heavily on Chinese labor, logistics, and infrastructure. Yes, it was slowly expanding in India, automating assembly training workers in Vietnam. But these were side bets, not replacements. In India, the chaos of port delays, energy shortages, and political instability posed challenges China had long since mastered. In Vietnam, scale remained limited. In Arizona, TSMC's new chip plant meant to secure a domestic supply faced delays and cost overruns. The illusion of diversification was just that, an illusion. China remained the center of Apple's universe, and so the company did what it had always done, avoided politics, doubled down on product. Each new iPhone came with better cameras, stronger chips, improved security. Apple leaned into services, iCloud, Apple TV Plus. App Store subscriptions, revenue streams, less dependent on hardware. It marketed itself as sustainable, ethical, progressive. But behind the marketing, the choices remained unchanged, because choosing meant consequences. If Apple chose the US, fully by exiting China, standing against censorship, defending labor rights, it would face economic retaliation, manufacturing chaos, and lost revenue. If it chose China, by aligning further, making deeper concessions, it would lose public trust, face regulatory backlash, and risk becoming a symbol of corporate cowardice. So it chose neither. It delayed, deflected, deferred, but the world around it was no longer willing to wait. Consumers began asking harder questions. Why did Apple remove VPN apps in China? Why did it encrypt US data but not Chinese data? Why did it tout sustainability but source materials from opaque suppliers? Why did it refuse to speak when it mattered? Investors once silent began to worry. Not just about ethics, but about risk. What if China invaded Taiwan? What if the US banned iPhones made with Chinese parts? What if the next Cold War turned hot? Because Apple's business wasn't just global, it was vulnerable. Every part, every assembly, every shipment could be caught in the crossfire of geopolitics. A trade embargo, a cyber attack, a diplomatic spat, any of these could cripple production overnight. In a divided world, neutrality becomes dangerous. And Apple was learning that too late. In 2024, the company took a rare symbolic step. It announced that iCloud data for all users, regardless of location, would be stored outside of China. The move sparked backlash in Beijing. The government hinted at unreliable entity designations. There were whispers of antitrust probes. Analysts warned of retaliation. But others saw it differently. For the first time, Apple was choosing a side. Not just politically, but morally. The choice was incomplete, imperfect, and overdue, but it was a start. Because Apple understood something it had long denied, that in a world of surveillance, repression, and division, technology is never neutral. It is either complicit or courageous. And for the millions who carry iPhones in their pockets, the choice matters. Not just for security, not just for freedom, but for the future. So where does Apple go from here? It cannot rebuild its supply chain overnight. It cannot erase its past. It cannot please both superpowers indefinitely. But it can chart a new path, one rooted not in illusion, but in integrity. A path where design meets responsibility, where privacy is not a slogan but a stance, where profits do not come at the price of silence. Apple may not win this war, but if it chooses to fight for its principles finally, it may help build a world worth winning. And that perhaps is the only battle that matters.